Hi, everybody. This is a podcast, Everything About Hockey. If you don't like hockey, you won't like this podcast. Today, I thought I'd talk about a little bit of a history of the NHL expansion. The NHL expansion, franchise expansion, team location, team history. First off, let me give you a base of exactly how these teams were formed. Now, we originally had 6 teams in the NHL. From 1942 to 1967, there were 6 teams. Boston Bruins, Chicago Blackhawks, Detroit Red Wings, Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, that was going on for 25 years. Those teams played in the NHL. And then, in 1967, they decided to expand. Clinton Campbell decided to expand the NHL. Now, he was the president of the NHL from 1946 to 1977. And he got the beginning of the expansion era, the great class of 67 expansion. And that was the California Golden Seals, the Philadelphia Flyers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the St. Louis Blues, the Los Angeles Kings, and the Minnesota North Stars. They also did an expansion in 1970, which was Vancouver Canucks and the Buffalo Sabres. He also did an expansion in 1972, which was the Atlanta Flames and the New York Islanders. And in 1974, he expanded to Kansas City, and he had the Kansas City Scouts and the Washington Capitals in Washington, D.C. And in 1977 to 1992, John Ziegler became president of the NHL. Now, he absorbed the World Hockey Association, which disbanded in 1979. And the NHL decided they were going to take 4 teams from that league. They took the Edmonton Oilers, Quebec Nordiques, Hartford Whalers, and the original Winnipeg Jets. Yeah, the host had took all the teams from the Great White North during that expansion from the Western Hockey Association's disbandal in 1979, which was kind of interesting, too, by a little side note, because the Houston Aeros at the time had a really solid financial base and a solid fan base, too, and that team didn't get absorbed. But of course, then in 1991, he also expanded the Bay Area again since 1975. That's the last time I had a team. And that was the San Jose Sharks. They became an expansion team in 1991. And of course, in 1992, John Ziegler was forced to step down as president, and Gil Stein became president in 1992, and he only lasted a year, 1993. But he did have one expansion occur under his watch, and that was 1992. And that was the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Ottawa Senators. Then we'll look at the Gary Bettman expansion. Now, he became, instead of president, he became commissioner in 1993 to present time. So in the time when he took over as commissioner, they had 24 teams. So at this point in time, he expanded. His first expansion was the Florida Panthers and the Anaheim Mighty Ducks. They began playing in 1993 to 94. Of course, similar to previous expansion plans and cycles, the NHL tried to place teams in the southern part of the United States. And they did the exact same thing in the next group of expansions, too. The Nashville Predators became an expansion team in 1998. The Atlanta Thrashers became an expansion team in 1999. Minnesota Wild and the Columbus Blue Jackets in 2000. The Vegas Golden Knights in 2017, and the Seattle Kraken in 2021. That was his expansion. But he also had some pretty major relocations under Bettman's tenure. Minnesota North Stars, the original Minnesota North Stars, moved to Dallas, became the Dallas Stars in 1993. The Quebec Nordiques moved to Denver, became the Colorado Avalanche in 1995. And the original Winnipeg Jets moved to Phoenix and became the Phoenix Coyotes, and now the Arizona Coyotes in 1996. And the Hartford Whalers moved to North Carolina in 1997 and became the Carolina Hurricanes. And also, the Atlanta Thrashers moved to Winnipeg, and now it's the new Winnipeg Jets. That occurred in 2000 11. So now let's look at the individual teams and how they actually became their present location. The first one I'm going to look at is the California Golden Seals. From 1967 to 1976, they were based in Oakland, California. They were part of the 67 expansion team. Remember that? They never earned a winning record and only made the playoffs twice in the 9 years they were played in Oakland. They also played in San Francisco, too, for a little while. But unfortunately, the Bay Area was not really a great hockey market for them. But you also have to remember the CBS had a TV deal with the NHL at that point in time. And then that deal, it required the NHL to have two teams based in California. One of the teams was the LA Kings, and the other team was the California Golden Seals. They had to have them playing either in Oakland or San Francisco to make this requirement for the CBS TV deal. But unfortunately, they weren't making money. So, in Oakland, they were doing okay money-wise, but there really wasn't much expansion for finances reasons in Oakland. Now, San Francisco, there was a lot of opportunity to expand financially in that San Francisco market, but they really didn't have as much interest in hockey in San Francisco, so the fan base really wasn't that great. So at one time, they decided to relocate. They thought they were going to have a chance to relocate to Vancouver because there was a ownership group that wanted to move a team to Vancouver. Because if you remember right, Vancouver and Buffalo were originally discussed in the 67 expansion, but both were rejected. But unfortunately, because of the TBS deal, the Board of Governors rejected the move to Vancouver for the California Golden Seals. Now, the Seals did decide to try to sue for the right to actually move. They used the Sherman Act, which basically said that a corporation, the Sherman Act basically said that a corporation could determine where the franchises are located so they make sure the franchises aren't competing with each other. The California Golden Seals ownership rejected that idea, but the NHL wanted the Sherman Act to kick in to make sure they could determine where franchises were located. But the courts ruled in favor of the NHL to block the move to Vancouver. So it stood in San Francisco for the rest of the time. But unfortunately, when the World Hockey Association started up, one of the teams that really hit hard by the World Hockey's signing of players was the California Golden Seals. It wiped out a large group of their roster. At the present time, 5 of the top 10 scorers on that roster were actually signed by the World Hockey Association. Because the World Hockey League teams were signing players from the Golden Seals roster, that roster was quite depleted at this point in time. In 1975, a newspaper report says that the Seals, California Golden Seals, and the Pittsburgh Penguins were to be relocated to Denver and Seattle, respectively. Arrangements would be seen to be 2 teams would sold to groups in those other 2 cities that have already been awaiting teams that they would be playing in the 1976-77 season. But the league decided to nick that as also and cancel those agreements and blocked the Seals and the Penguins from moving at their present locations at the time of the transfer. But unfortunately, at the time when all this was going down, the Bay Area was thinking about building a new arena for the California Seals. But since all this occurred, the city government decided to cancel the new agreement and basically blocked them from any new revenue of a new arena. And because of this, because of poor attendance and low finance, the league finally dropped their objection to relocation of the franchise and agreed to let the present ownership move to a new location. Okay, now this is where it gets real interesting. And I don't know why John Ziegler let this thing get like this. Almost like it was like a soap opera, and now it turned into. When Jordan Guns, the current owner of the California Golden Seals decided to move the team to his hometown, Cleveland, Ohio. It really got interesting because remember now, CBS TV agreement had expired at this point in time, 1975. So the league gave the ownership of the Seals to be able to move to wherever they'd like to move. And now Guns is from Cleveland, Ohio, so he decided to put this team into Cleveland, become the Cleveland Barons. Now the Barons would play in Richfield Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio. It's like halfway between Cleveland and Akron. Richfield Coliseum was actually going to be the largest arena the NHL would be playing at the time. The seat capacity was 18,500. But because he moved this team so quick, he actually moved this team in just over a summer with no real plans in Cleveland to actually set up a good marketing plan, promotions, get people actually fired up to actually see a NHL team in Cleveland. And it turned out the first 2 years of this expansion, they only drew an average about 10,000 people a game. And they only had 7 sellouts in 40 games. So that was actually in worse shape than it was when they were in Oakland. They had the same problems. It was just a bad attendance and poor management of how this team should be ran. So the current ownership in 1977 at All-Star break asked John Ziegler and the Board of Governors if they could actually have him help them with payroll because they were afraid that the next 2 payroll cycles, the Barons ownership wasn't going to be able to pay the players. They needed a bailout for the Board of Governors at this point in time. And it was so bad that the other teams knew about this lack of money. They were actually contacting Barons players and talking to them often on the side how much money it take for them to actually play, Barons players to play on their team. The payroll situation was so bad. Now, meanwhile, in Minnesota, the North Stars, they were having some financial difficulty too with their ownership. So the Gunn family decided to talk to the present owner of the Minnesota North Stars of a possible merger between the 2 teams. And the league kind of figured, well, if they do this, it's best to have 1 team fold than have 2 teams fold. So this might not be a bad idea. And they actually agreed to actually do this. So for the long-term stability of the league, in 1978, the Board of Governors agreed to realign the North Stars and the Cleveland Barons together. Now, the Gunn family, the owner of the Cleveland Barons, since he had the more money and he was supposedly the more stable of the ownership, he would take control over the Minnesota North Stars, but the Minnesota North Stars would keep the North Stars' colors and histories and the location. So basically, he had rights now. He actually had rights to the Minnesota North Stars. And actually, Cleveland Barons are the only team to actually be folded at an NHL franchise. That's the only NHL franchise that ever folded is the Cleveland Barons franchise. Now let's look and see what happened to the Minnesota North Stars during his ownership. Remember, for recap, he basically only had 2 years in Cleveland. He moved it in one summer, had 2 years, total waste of money. He lost everything. And now the Board of Governors are letting him have another franchise. He already ran the California Golden Seals into the ground. He already ran the Cleveland Barons into the ground. And now he's got the Minnesota North Stars, Gordon Gunn. So after chronic problems again in Minnesota, after 1984, they decided he wanted to now move the Minnesota North Stars back to San Francisco Bay and become the San Francisco North Stars. The league said, no, we're not going to let you do this again. But they did agree that the ownership be allowed to purchase the rights to a new expansion franchise in 1991 in the Bay Area, which is the San Jose Sharks. Instead of moving Minnesota to San Francisco, they told them to keep Minnesota in Minnesota, and we'll go ahead and let you have rights to the San Jose Sharks, the new expansion franchise in San Francisco. Amazingly enough. and he would receive visa through the draft. He was only allowed to actually take some players from Minnesota. So during the draft, what he's going to do is they're going to split the expansion draft team up, and Minnesota was going to get some players, and San Jose was going to get some play through the expansion draft. Then in return, he would sell the Minnesota North Stars to another owner, and then he would take total control of the San Jose Sharks expansion franchise when they started their season in 90-91. And he sold the team in 1992 to Norm Green. He became the new Minnesota North Stars owner, and Gunn now became the owner of the San Jose Sharks. Amazingly enough. Now he's ran 3 teams down, and now they actually give him an opportunity to have an expansion team. I'm always still amazed at this when I read this in Hockey News back then. And of course now with a shrinking poor attendance, shrinking revenue, and a new arena not being done in Minnesota. Of course, Chicago and St. Louis, they both got new arenas about the same time. The new ownership decided to, let's just go ahead and just go back to California again. And they wanted to play the Los Angeles Stars playing in the new arena, which was just built in Anaheim, the Honda Center in California, Anaheim, California. However, the league at the time had already promised the Walt Disney Corporation that they could have an expansion franchise to play in the Honda Center in Anaheim. They became the Anaheim Mighty Ducks. So they told Green, the owner, that the North Stars could relocate to a city other than Anaheim of his choosing. So in 1993, he decided to move to Dallas, Texas, and become the Texas Stars. Of course, now the relocation took place in 1992-93. So, it's amazing how many twists and turns. It's like a soap opera with this franchise. Of course, then the ownership to Green, he actually then sold the owner. He sold it to a present owner about 2 years later. And now the ownership now in Dallas is pretty stable. So let's look at another franchise, the Kansas City Scouts, and see what happened there. This is also a team that, you like those actually team that actually achieved something, but it didn't quite work out. In 1974, they added 2 teams in the NHL. In Kansas City, Missouri, and Washington, D.C. They had the Kansas City Scouts and the Washington Capitals. And the Scouts were supposed to play at Kemper Arena, which was a newly constructed arena in Kansas City. And the original name of the Kansas City Scouts was supposed to be the Kansas City Mohawks, because they wanted to merge the state of Kansas and the state of Missouri together, which, there is Kansas City, Missouri. Kind of combine the names. That's why they came up with the Mohawks, but unfortunately, with a very loud rejection, Chicago Blackhawks did not like having another team called the Mohawks. They wanted to keep the Hawks, of course, the Hawks has always been known as the Blackhawks. And with, poor attendance, lack of interest in Kansas City, the team really ran in some really financial cost, and the ownership really wasn't that organized at the time. And of course, there was also an economic downturn in the Midwest in the mid-'70s, which led to poor performance on and off the ice. The Scouts only averaged 8,218 people per game for those 2 years, and they actually had a 17,000-seat arena. So it was actually pretty empty. And this team also didn't have just one owner. It had a whole corporation owning it. So they actually had 37 owners running this team, trying to actually make decisions, which I found really quite fascinating at the time. How did they actually come up with a agreed concept or game plan for actually marketing the team and promoting it when you had that many owners giving you that many ideas? And at the time of the move, they only had 2,000 season ticket holders in Kansas City. Now, Washington at the same time when they came in, they had the same problems. They had financial downturn. They had some poor attendance. But the ownership at Washington, the Washington Capitals, was a lot more, they had a lot deeper pockets. A lot deeper pockets, easier for me to say, than the Kansas City Scouts did. So they were actually able to survive the rough times, but Kansas City wasn't able to. So they decided to sell the franchise, and they decided to move it to Denver and rename it the Denver Rockies. And they got to play in the new McNichols Sports Arena, which was just built for the Colorado Rockies. I mean, this is a state-of-the-art arena. It was nice. But unfortunately, stuff followed it again. And the lack of stability plagued this team again for the first 8 years. The Rockies went through 10 coaches. One of them lasted less than full 2 seasons. With poor attendance, lack of stability, the franchise is on the move again. They decided then to move east to Newark, New Jersey, and become the New Jersey Devils in the fall of 1982. And of course, the reputation still followed this team. In 1983, after the Devils lost to the Edmonton Oilers 13-4, Wayne Gretzky, in a post-game interview actually, said this Devils were putting together a Mickey Mouse operation on and off the ice. And of course, it stayed like that for a long period of time until the Devils started winning the cups in the early 90s with the Trap, and then they started becoming a cup contender. Now let's look at the next team I want to focus on. Let's look at the Quebec Nordiques. Remember, they were in the World Hockey Association when the World Hockey and the NHL merged, and they were scheduled to play in the 1978-79 season. Remember, they were actually merged in with the Hartford Whalers, Edmonton Oilers, and the old Winnipeg Jets. Now, this franchise also had some serious trouble. I mean, they repeatedly were always at the bottom of the draft. They had some financial troubles. They've actually asked the league to help do a bailout one time, and the Quebec government rejected that. And the also problem was back at the time, Quebec was a very French-speaking province. And for instance, if you were an English-speaking player on that province in Quebec City, there was only one English-speaking privately owned radio station. And when it comes to television stations, there were no English-speaking television stations. And the newspaper, there was only one newspaper that was English-speaking, and that only was printed once a week. So even back in before this incident with which I'm going to talk about, the Eric Lindros incident, it was always kind of hard for English-speaking players to kind of get used to being in Quebec. So when Quebec Nordiques, back in June of 1992, had the first overall pick, and they decided to pick Eric Lindros, which already basically said that he was not going to play for Quebec because of how the team was ran. He always considered that as a bottom feeder team in a very small market. And it is a very small market. It was at the time, it was the smallest market in the league. I mean, it didn't help that matters much. So when he refused to actually play for him, the ownership at the time said that they're not going to trade him. He's never going to play pro hockey ever again. Well, they decided to change that decision, and they decided to actually trade him to Philadelphia Flyers in June of 1992. And boy, did they get a bunch of talent. They got Peter Forsberg, an elite Hall of Fame forward. Mike Ricci, I loved him. He was a big power forward. Goaltender Ron Hexall, and Steve Duchesne, and Kelly Hoffman, and future consideration enforcer Chris Simon. Now, I don't know if you youngsters out there know what an enforcer is, but that used to be what we call the people who used to fight in NHL back in the good old days. And they also got 2 first-round picks. And they got in American money, $15 million. And they also got one more draft pick out of it. One of the draft picks out of it was Jocelyn Thibault. And then their own pick at the time was Adam Demarche. Of course, Jocelyn Thibault got flipped over for Patrick Waugh. You might have heard him. I recognize that name. Hall of Famer. So, this trade actually made the Nordiques transfer from a doormat team or a bottom feeder into a legitimate Stanley Cup contender. with just one trade. And that's one of the reasons why Eric Lindros didn't want to go for the Avalanche, is because they were considered on his part as a doormat or a bottom feeder. And the language was not the problem there, he said, in a quote. It was how the management ran this Nordic organization. But one simple move on his part made this team into a totally different level of play. But they still had serious problems. Remember, this team was still a very small market team. It didn't actually have a whole lot to go with at this point in time. With the English-speaking problem it had and the money and the bailouts it kept going with the government. And the government, Quebec province government, repeatedly turned them down on requests to bailouts. I mean, they were put right behind Green Bay as the smallest city. But see, Green Bay, the home of the NHL or NFL, Green Bay Packers, however, had a long-time support from the nearby major markets like Milwaukee to lure people to the Packers games. Quebec doesn't have that option of having a big city real close to it to actually draw fans to the Nordiques games, and they still got that same problem. So I'm not too sure how they'd overcome that if they ever did get a new team. Now let's look at the next team I'm going to follow. Now the next team is going to be the Hartford Whalers. They were also in the World Hockey Association merger. Now this team here, it only had 18 years of being in Hartford. It only made the playoffs 8 times and only won 1 playoff series. They were still strapped with financial trouble too. They had poor attendance. In 1991, when they traded Ron Francis to Pittsburgh, it really put a real thorn in the side of Whaler fans. And it really cost them a lot of goodwill. And I think that really hurt the team. That trade in 91 really hurt that team. And then, of course, the 94-95 season, they were able to draft Chris Pronger. He was a stud defenseman at the time. But unfortunately, because of the financial restraints and the real desire to have a winning program, they were real slow with how Chris Pronger was being developed. And they made a decision to trade him to St. Louis Blues for exchange for Brendan Shanahan. But Shanahan was not happy to go to Hartford. He wanted to be in a bigger market with a lot more potential. And even before the first single game in Hartford, he was not thrilled with playing there. So when the 1996-97 season ended, Shanahan finally broke silence and demanded out of Hartford. He wanted out because he claimed he didn't want to play in a small market team with an uncertain future about its location. Shanahan was then traded to the Detroit Red Wings for Keith Primo and Paul Coffey and a first-round draft pick. That basically then set the ball rolling for the departure out of Hartford for the Hartford Whalers. You're starting to see a trend here. Every time a team tends to get into some real financial trouble, they tend to ship off star players, and then the opposing players don't seem to want to show up and play for them. It tends to be a really big red flag for fan bases that they're in some serious trouble. But the owners of the Hartford Whalers did pledge that they would keep the team there until 1994. However, 2 years later, with frustration of financial trouble and with only 11,000 season ticket holders, early 1997, the Connecticut governor stated that he did not want to spend taxpayers' money on fund a new arena for Hartford. So basically, the Whalers didn't have a new building. They actually wanted the plans for a $147 million arena to actually be built downtown, and they also wanted to get another $45 million to cover losses for those 3 years that this building was going to be built. And the governor of Connecticut said, "Nah, we're not spending the money for this." So the Whalers unfortunately made a decision to leave Hartford after the 1996-97 season. The owners first originally discussed about relocating the Whalers to Norfolk, Virginia. The first major team in that market, the Hampton Roads owner, unfortunately could not get a good enough season ticket drive in Norfolk, and that deal fell through. Then a year earlier, there was already some talk between Nashville, Columbus, and a southern suburb of Detroit to move the Whalers up there. And he continued talks with both Nashville and Columbus to see if he could get a deal there. But they didn't quite come up with enough to actually pull this off. So the owner then announced that he did have a deal in works with Raleigh, North Carolina, to become the Carolina Hurricanes, which play their first 2 seasons in North Carolina's Greensboro Coliseum, a minor league rink, while the rink was being constructed in Raleigh. So, basically, Raleigh is actually the last resort for this Hartford Whalers organization to move to. Okay, let's do a trivia for the next one. What U.S. city had 3 pro hockey teams leave that city and move to Canada? Can you guess the city, my next city I'm going to talk about? Okay, I'll give you a hint. The 3 cities in Canada that these teams moved to was Calgary, Quebec, and Winnipeg. I'll give you a few more minutes to think. What do you think it is? I'll play some more music so you can think about what city I'm going to talk about next. Okay, the city is, drum roll, it's Atlanta. I'm going to talk about the Atlanta Thrashers. And the cities are, the Atlanta Flames was established in 1972. They departed to Canada in 1980 and became the Calgary Flames. The Atlanta Flames was one of the first attempts to have teams in the south part of the U.S. for the NHL. The next one is the IHL Atlanta Knights. They moved to Quebec in 1992 to 96. And then, of course, the Atlanta Thrashers, they also moved to Winnipeg. It became the new Winnipeg Jets. Now let's kind of talk about what happened in Atlanta to move this team to Winnipeg. Okay, in 1997, Atlanta, Georgia got a expansion team. Time Warner owned this team. They also owned the Atlanta Hawks at the time. And they were both sold to Spirit of Atlanta in 2003. Now, before that, the Thrashers, they were doing okay. They were averaging about 13,000 fans, but they still weren't making a whole lot of money. When 2003, when the Spirit of Atlanta LLC group took control of this team, which is a group of businessmen from Atlanta that took control of the Atlanta Thrashers and the Atlanta Hawks. And right after they took control of this team, 8 days later, tragedy hit. Star forward and number 1 draft pick, Danny Heatley, crashed his Ferrari when in one car accident, seriously hurt himself, and Dan Snyder. Unfortunately, Dan Snyder died 5 days later due to his injuries. That put a real damper on this whole entire franchise right off the bat there. And so before the next season, the 2005-2006 season, before that season, they kind of turned things around. The ownership tried to do a little investment on some players through free agency. They acquired Bobby Hollick, Scott Melleby, and Mike Dunham, goaltender, to try to give this thing a real boost. But at the same time, Danny Heatley just didn't feel like being in Atlanta after this. So he requested a trade to get out of town from that car accident that happened in 2003. And he was eventually swapped with a trade with the Ottawa Senators to get Marian Hossa. Now, in 2006-2007, they had brief success. Marian Hossa and Ian Kovalchuk had great years that year. And they actually won their first playoff appearance. They actually won the Southeast Division title with 43 wins, and they were in the third seat in the Eastern Conference, and they got home ice advantage in the first round. They had to play the New York Rangers. Unfortunately, though, New York Rangers swept them in 4 games in the Eastern Conference quarterfinals. But due to financial losses and struggling at the gate, it was frequently targeted as rumors throughout this whole entire time that they be relocated to either Kansas City, Quebec, Hamilton, or Winnipeg. On June the 22nd, 2021, the ownership group Spirit of Atlanta announced that they were losing $130 million in the last 6 years, and this team couldn't lose any more money. So they made a decision to keep the Atlanta Hawks, but they were going to sell the Atlanta Thrashers. On May 16th, the Atlanta newspaper reported the talks between them and True North Sports and Entertainment, which was located in Winnipeg, and they had a deal temporarily set up. The deal was finally finalized on May the 20th, 2021, and they were relocated to Winnipeg. True North said the team name wouldn't be announced until they got the season ticket holders and all the finances set up. At that point in time, they also announced that the Thrashers' name and colors would not be going to Winnipeg. True North was going to rename the team a wholly different name, and Spirit of Atlanta would keep the Thrashers' name, logo, and colors as their rights. A few days later, True North announced that the team would be named the Winnipeg Jets, like the old old NHL team, and they would keep their own colors and logo from the Winnipeg Jets. Now, I would talk about the old WHA Winnipeg Jets, but I'm getting awful long-winded here, and I think you're probably getting bored listening to me, but I'll basically tell you this. The first Winnipeg Jets team had to move because of financial restraints, the size of the market, and the fact that there was no salary cap. At the time, they were really financially troubled, similar to what Hartford and Quebec had, with no salary cap, larger market teams, a lot more draw in the U.S. than Canada because the Canadian dollar wasn't very strong. The Winnipeg Jets, the old Jets, decided to move to Phoenix in 1993 and become the Phoenix Coyotes. Of course, gradually they renamed themselves the Arizona Coyotes. And of course, I'm not even going to get into what's going on right now with the Arizona Coyotes because I have no idea really how that's going to end up. But thanks for listening to Everything About Hockey podcast. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.